Hello and welcome to the second annual Elizabeth Hearn Gleich lecture. My name is Sue Friedlander. I'm the executive director of the museum and library, which means I get to do a lot of things. And one of my favorite things is to welcome people like you to events like this, and to thank all of you for your support. It really means more than ever in these days. And I encourage you to keep coming, go to your nonprofits and support them, recognize them. If you participate in social media, participate. Our grantors watch those numbers, and that engagement is almost as important as being back in person again, which is still fantastic. Before we get to our distinguished speaker, I would like to take a few moments to thank people because it does take a village. I want to recognize the entire staff of the museum and library, especially our front desk clerks who are here working very hard. Tim is here, and Karen Schaefer. Eric Burke and Administrative Assistant Corey Seymour will be joining us later this evening. The bulk of the work today, I have to thank Library Director and Head of Staff Maria Cancro, who's in the back, and Curator of Education and Public Engagement, Mary Alexander, who's also off in the back in the corner. I'm especially pleased to welcome two volunteers from the Cooperstown Graduate Program, Nancy and Lizzie, who are with us today and doing so many things for us. And this is a great opportunity for them, and we're delighted to have them here today. I also want to thank our entire board who supports us tirelessly and without complaint. Well, we do have several board members here today. Cheryl Neal is with us, and Aaron Saley. Aaron also served on the planning committee for today's event and contributed 2 baskets to our silent auction. Immediate past president, Phyllis Lappy, not only contributed one of her beautiful pastels to our silent auction, but she also matted and framed all of the work on display in our Archives Vibes exhibit. She also dry mounts and bevel cuts all of our exhibit labels. So that's an important part of continuing service that we're really grateful for. And as a side note to our silent auction, that will close at 4:45. So have a look, admire, and write your name down. We really have some wonderful things. And I do want to thank all of our contributors to that auction. And finally, the sponsors of today's program, Julia Gleich and Jason Andrew. In her commitment to her students, Julia was unable to be with us today, but I have the great pleasure of welcoming Jason, who will say a few words about the inspiration for the lecture series and introduce today's speaker. So Jason, over to you.
Thank you. I drove up today out of the rain of Brooklyn, pouring rain, and as I took the exit into Canajoharie, the sun came out. So not only is that like, it happens every time I come to Canajoharie. Can I take this out?
Absolutely.
All right, great. I get the honor of talking about Elizabeth Hearn Gleich. She was a resident here of Canajoharie. Her father was Martin Hearn, who ran an insurance agency here. He started that insurance agency in 1936, and at that time, he also noticed a great need of the community to provide microloans to some people, to buy homes, to buy farm equipment, these kinds of things. And Elizabeth, Liz, who we call, I've known her for about 25 years. In one of her last moments before she wanted to move out west to visit her family, and actually moved to Ann Arbor, she said, I want to go to Canajoharie. And we all looked at each other and said, Canajoharie, okay. And the big draw for me was, as a curator and writer, art enthusiast, was the Winslow Homers, right? And this was before this became what it is, such a fantastic museum as well. I asked her for some anecdotes. She lives in New Jersey now, and I asked her for an anecdote, and it kind of takes a little while to get her talking, but then we realized she wanted to study about Tibet. So one day she marked into the library and said, I want all the books, checked out all the books on Tibet, because one day she wanted to actually go there. This was a place where she came to learn, where she came to study, where she came to escape. She'd walk her dog, Patches, down here, and they'd sit next to the fountain. She still has the big dream of going to Tibet, but she's now just going to, she says, I'm just going to stay stuck in Ocean City, New Jersey. Liz always thought this place was, quote, a little jewel locked into the middle of nowhere. And Julia, my colleague, we decided to establish this annual lecture to continue her enthusiasm, to continue inspiring people to come to the museum, inspiring educators and lecturers. So very excited. So I get the honor now, or you'll have to bear with me because I just got up here and I'm handed this to read. Our very distinguished lecturer today. It gives me the great pleasure to introduce this year's Elizabeth Hearn Gleich speaker, Dr. Gretchen Sorin. Today's speaker learned to love museums while prowling around the galleries of the Newark Museum with her brother. Well, that prowling led to a distinguished career as a museum educator, director, and consultant to more than 200 museums and over 30 years. In her current role as the director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program, our speaker teaches courses in museum studies, museum exhibition, and African American art, while also directing the program. In her extraordinary book, Driving While Black, our speaker drew on scholarship of her own memories of travel to present the significance of the automobile. To African Americans who relied on travel guides and information networks to keep them safe, the automobile was their freedom. Her personal experiences and scholarship will inspire today's talk. Dr. Sorin believes that museums are learning environments and have the civic responsibility to provide information and knowledge, artifacts, art, documents, and displayed in museums to teach us how to evaluate evidence, determine its veracity, and understand history. Today's talk, through the lens of a historian, our speaker will share his perspectives on the collection here, built by Bartlett Arkell, with particular focus on the portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. And the pairing of this image with our speakers driving while black may at first seem odd, but as we will see, I think that we'll find some very interesting analogies and perspectives here on this reinterpretation and re-understanding of these two great things. So it gives me great pleasure of handing over the mic in the most uneloquent way, I'm sorry. But here it is. Thank you. Everyone welcome Dr. Gretchen Sorin. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here, and it's really my pleasure to have been asked to be the Gleich speaker this year.
Gretchen, mic a little closer.
Mic a little closer.
Yeah.
Is that better? Is that better? And I want to thank Susan and the staff here for all of their kindness and assistance in helping me prepare for this lecture. And Jason, of course, thank you. It's great to meet you. And thank you for safely getting up here from Brooklyn. I know things are pretty scary down there now. Everybody thinks I'm always going to talk about cars. So I decided I would at least put up a car so you could see it. When Susan, who, by the way, is a fabulous art historian, when she asked me to come and give this lecture, I really at first thought she wanted me to talk about Driving While Black. And she said, no, you have to talk about the collection. So I thought, okay, well, let me come up and look at the collection again and kind of get some ideas. Unfortunately, there are no cars in the collection, so I wasn't able to. I'm just going, thank God there are no cars in the collection. But I realized that I had, in the past, a background in the 18th century. I started my museum career in the 18th century, studying the 18th century, and so I'm going to talk a lot about that, but I'm gonna take you on a little trip back in time. We're gonna go backwards and end up at the very end of my talk about George Washington. As a historian and curator, I always look at stories, and when I look at collections, I'm thinking about what stories can these collections tell. I'm looking at stories more than I'm looking at aesthetics, which art historians look at. And I'm looking at different ways of thinking about pictures and thinking about evidence. And this is my second job in the museum field. I was the director of Gadsby's Tavern in Alexandria, Virginia. And Gadsby's Tavern, the building on your left, was built in 1792, and the building on your right is a little bit later. And I can tell you that this was George Washington's Tavern. Monticello is right down the road. Mount Vernon is right down the road. And when George Washington needed a drink, this is where he went. This is what the tap room looks like. And this is the ballroom. And I'm showing you the ballroom because this is the place that the birthnight ball of George Washington was held every year. The first celebration of George Washington's birthday was at Valley Forge in 1798. And then John Gadsby, the owner of the City Hotel here, hosted his birthday in 1798 and 1799, and he attended. So this was the place that George Washington celebrated his birthday. And it is still celebrated to this day, as you can see here. This is the ballroom of Gadsby's Tavern with people today. If you go there in February, on February 22nd, you will see people dressed in colonial costumes celebrating George's birthday. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that birth night was like. So we have some actual descriptions, so we know what they did. The day was ushered in by a discharge of cannon. In the evening, there was a splendid ball at the City Tavern at which George Washington was present. The following toasts were drank by a company of gentlemen who dined together in celebration of the day at the Union, accompanied by another discharge of cannon. So it was a big deal. The whole idea of celebrating the president's birth comes from England, celebrating the monarch's birth. And there was a great deal of discussion about whether or not we should celebrate the president's birthday as a national holiday, because of course we didn't want to have a monarch. This was a democracy. In 1805, women were then allowed to come to the birth night. And Lucinda Herbert, who was the granddaughter of John Carlisle, the Carlisle house is right around the corner from Gadsby's Tavern. She was at the birth night, and she described the birth night ball supper as being very elegant. A large cake in the center of the table, ornamented with an equestrian statue of George Washington, the whole covered with a sugar candy net in the form of a cone, on top of which was the American eagle. A variety of ornamented cakes, sugar baskets, pyramids, West India fruit served on glass gave a beautiful effect to the whole. There were 1,100 persons at the city ball. Every room and even the passages were filled with company. I cannot imagine what this building would have been like with 1,100 people in it. And there was dancing, and you can see the musicians gallery on top, which is where the musicians would be placed, but I cannot imagine how stuffed that would have been, that building. This is a photograph. Thinking about the images of George Washington and 18th century images got me thinking about the camera and what the camera means to us and what it means to our lives and what it means to us to be able to see the people that came before us. I got this photograph last year. It's a terrible photograph, as you can see. I had never seen my maternal grandfather. I always wondered what he looked like. And last year, a man named Ken Wooten called me up and he said, "I'm your cousin. We've never met, but I knew your mother." And my mother is this person right here. And I said to him, "Do you have a picture of Abel Wooten, my grandfather? And he said, oh yeah, I do. This is the picture he had. And one of those men standing on the top step is my grandfather, who I had never seen in my entire life. So it was very exciting to me to be able to see for the first time my grandfather. He died before I was born. And it really started me thinking about cameras and what those cameras, there's Nancy back there with her camera, what those cameras mean for us. Think about how important your photograph albums are to you, how important getting that photographer for your child's wedding or your those special events in your life, and to be able to look back at those photographs. So the camera for taking daguerreotypes was the first commercially successful photographic process. And it was introduced by Louis Daguerre in 1839. With the daguerreotype, the image specifically goes onto a silver copper plate, and the surface of the daguerreotype is like a mirror. So if you've ever seen a daguerreotype, that's why they add those black velvet pieces behind the daguerreotype so you can see it as a positive. This is the very first photograph we know of that has people in it. Do you see the people? Teeny little people over there. First in the world. This is 1838. So imagine what it must have meant to a world where if you had enough money to have your portrait painted, you could preserve your likeness. If you didn't, your likeness would not be preserved. But here, very beginning of photography. And this is Paris, the Place de la République, and the very first evidence of human beings on a photograph. Just for a little perspective, this is Place de la République in 1900, and here it is, modern day photograph. Now this is John Quincy Adams. He holds the distinction of being the very first US president photographed, though he wasn't in office at the time. This is him captured in his home in Quincy, Massachusetts in 1843. This is 14 years after he left office. And it's a daguerreotype. It's not a photograph on paper. So I guess I'd ask a couple of questions. Does a painting change the way you think about a person? This is John Quincy Adams as well. This is a year later. This is 1844. Does it change your perception of the sitter? Here's the photograph. Are photos more authentic than paintings? Does the artist take liberties with the painting? Just some questions to think about. We know precisely what Amelia Earhart looked like by having her photograph. And this is a photograph in the collection of the Arkell Museum. This gives us a little bit of a glimpse, a tiny, tiny glimpse of the African American community in Birmingham, Alabama. And this is Eulalia Barrow Gaines with a sample girl and Miles College student Eleanor Thompson. It's in Birmingham, it's 1937. And I was very interested in several things. The background, which is clearly, it's a little bit of the glimpse into the black community in Birmingham, because this would have been a segregated community. The woman on the left is the sister of prizefighter Joe Louis, and she also appears in several Beech-Nut advertisements. And this image appeared in the Birmingham Times, so we know that Beech-Nut hired people of color, hired African Americans. She's got on an old-fashioned outfit, sample girl outfit. This is what the modern outfit of the time looked like. So we're not sure exactly. I guess the question would be, why is she wearing this old-fashioned outfit? Why is the black woman wearing this old-fashioned outfit? We don't know that.
What was she sampling?
Gum.
Oh, it was gum. Okay.
Gum. Now I'm going to jump to a painter. This is Winslow Homer. And Winslow Homer, a famous quote was, "When you paint, try to put down exactly what you see. Whatever else you have to offer will come out anyway." So Homer felt that his paintings, that his work was documentation. This is the Historic Park Church in Boston. It's the church that Homer's mother attended. And I'm showing it to you because Homer was an abolitionist. And certainly that perspective is included, it seems to me, in his art. His mother was a staunch abolitionist, and this was a staunchly abolitionist church. Homer was hired, he was 25 years old, he was embedded with Union troops. He worked for Harper's, which was kind of like the Life magazine of its day. And he is one of the few visual artists of the Civil War who was actually going onto the battlefield. Photography existed during Homer's time, but it was very young. And as you can imagine, it was incredibly difficult to process photographs in the field. So instead, they're sending out illustrators who are making sketches and sending back those sketches to be made into lithographs. Homer was also embedded with the 61st New York Infantry and the 5th New York Infantry, and they were known as Durier's Zouaves. That's one of the reasons we have so many pictures that Homer does of people in Zouave uniforms. And they're the absolute coolest uniforms. We also know that his pictures of African Americans are very sympathetic. They're very different from the kinds of images that other artists of the period are making. So this is one of the engravings that he does. This is Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, ejected from Tremont Temple in Boston in December of 1860. What's really fascinating about this, I think, is that it's Tremont Temple, a Jewish temple. So obviously, a Jewish community here in Boston is involved in abolitionism. And this image may illustrate, I think, both Homer's support of abolition as well as his involvement with the Jewish community. And what they're doing here is commemorating the death of John Brown, and they got driven out of the temple because that was an incredibly controversial thing to be doing. John Brown was seen as a seditionist and a traitor. But just so you have an example of some of the kinds of stereotypical advertising that existed during the time that many artists were doing and that existed in the popular media. Here you see an ad for the Universal Clothes Wringer, and at the bottom we have people who were speaking in dialect. And this is kind of typical for, it's an envelope, and it says secession on the bottom. So they're talking about runaways and contrabands here. But here's how Homer depicts contrabands. And this is from a sketch that he made during the Civil War, and then he turns it into a painting in 1875. And here you see a soldier in a Zouave uniform. It's a very sympathetic image, a very kind soldier who is sharing his canteen with this African-American child who's probably following the soldiers with his family. He's barefoot, but it's a sympathetic portrayal of a man and a child. He's giving the child some water from his canteen. Many of Homer's images are like this one, just called Pitching Quoits. This is the first major painting of the Civil War. He tended to like the scenes of camp life rather than the horrors of war. And he was fascinated, as I said, with Zouaves and with contrabands. And you can see here the Zouave uniform that was based on elite French units. And I, for the life of me, can't understand why anyone would wear a red uniform in the war, because it makes you a much better target. But that's, excuse me?
The red coats did.
I know, I just don't understand red as a uniform color. But contrast Homer's paintings of camp life, and they're playing a game here, with this photograph of Alexander Gardner of the Civil War. He clearly depicts the horrors of war, the death and devastation. So clearly a document about the horrors of war. This silhouette, which is in the collection here of DeWitt Clinton, I wanted you to look at this silhouette because this was a much cheaper way of producing accessible images of people. So you might be able to afford to have your silhouette cut if you couldn't afford a painting, a portrait. And there were many, many silhouette cutters, and you could go to a local fair and have your silhouette cut. But this is an amazing, and there's only one of a kind. I've never seen another one. This belongs to the National African American Museum, and it's a silhouette of an African woman, an enslaved woman from Connecticut from 1796. It's her profile. What I think is particularly fascinating, other than the fact that there's a silhouette of this black woman, is that we see her African hair. We see the spikiness of her African hair. It was probably made to identify her in the event that she ran away. You can see the shape of her face, but of course, in a silhouette, you don't get to see any details, right? So people were able to have silhouettes made if they could afford them, and it made images more accessible, but still they weren't very detailed. So another story I'd like to talk about is the Erie Canal. This is an image from the collection called New York and the Erie Canal. It's by William Coventry Wall, and it's really a wonderful idealized view of the canal landscape. We see placid water, a huge expanse of space. It documents the landmass known as the Noses. And we see the canal here as well as the Mohawk River, it's interesting that both of them are placid here. We know that one of the reasons for building the canal was that the Mohawk River was pretty rough. Lots of rocks, lots of rapids. But we see the canal here without any buildings. I'm not sure exactly where the railroad would be, but it's certainly not in this picture. There are farm fields and a canal boat, but no warehouse, no buildings anywhere along the way, just a lone canal boat. So very idealized image. This is William Rickerby Miller's The Mohawk Valley at Little Falls, and this is from 1888. And the painting clearly shows the treacherous nature of the Mohawk. The Mohawk River is the river on the left side, and you can see all the rocks and all the rapids, and the reason for building the canal. This is an early canal in the foreground. It's not the Erie Canal yet, but the canal water is very smooth, and so you're starting to see some buildings here. This is my favorite, and this is the one we know the least about. Genre paintings like this one show us ordinary people and their work. They show us the people who never could afford a portrait, whose lives we only know through documents and perhaps paintings. And there's very little known about the artist. This is a folk painting. The only thing we know is his name is S. Georges, and that this was painted in 1856. But it really gives us an incredibly detailed description of canal life. So this is the full painting, but I'm going to show you some details. And so here on the left side of the painting, he's painted boats. And he's telling us what the boats looked like. Some were for passengers, some were for goods, like grain or oysters. Boats had to be low and they had to be flat to get under the many bridges that the canal had. It was only 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. So the boats had no motors. They just glided along because it was placid, and they were pulled by either mules or horses. And notice how still the water is, and very little movement. And this is a photograph of a canal boat, and you can see the equipment that's on top, the merchandise that's on top. And this is another document that tells us what those boats look like. So combining this document with this document, we get a good idea of how those boats looked and how they were used. Horses and mules were stabled below deck, so they would actually be on some of these boats. This is one of the boats. that would have horses on it. They had 9 by 12 feet, and the animals, they had put tar paper down on the floor of the boat. You can imagine why, right? Because they didn't want the urine and the feces to go and rot the boat out. And the boats usually carried 2 teams of draft animals so that one team could work while the other team rested. And they were rotated in 6-hour shifts. So the canals were very busy because they kept going. This is my favorite part of that painting. Oh. And you can see lots of detail here. You can see the barrels and the packages that the boat is carrying, but you can also see that people lived in these boats and that they hung their laundry. All the way over on the left, there's a woman hanging the laundry. And in the middle, there's an African-American man playing the fiddle. So you get a little glimpse here of what canal life was like. And of course, operation of the canal was very dependent on animals. And there are animal buildings all over, on both sides of the canal. And you can see this building is on one side. I cannot figure out what that is growing on the side of this building. Well, you know, I asked a barn expert, that my colleague Cindy Falk, who wrote the book on New York barns, and she wasn't sure. I was wondering if it was hops.
It doesn't matter whether the barn relates to hops.
Just they were growing hops.
Structure on the outside, looks like hops.
It's a very cool building. And there you can see horses, and clearly these are animal buildings, right? Barns. This is another one. Both sides, and also you see that guy standing there? If you could see it closely, he's urinating. He just had to go. And there are two cows standing in this painting, and I think they're Devons. Devon was a breed that was used for milk, it was used for cheese, it was used for beef. They are excellent tasting, and they can be raised on poor land, and they were very popular. And the earliest Devons came to this country in 1623. They came to Plymouth. So doesn't that look like a Devon? Come on, Rabbit, don't you think that's a Devon? You don't think it's a Devon?
Yeah, it looks like
It looks like a Devon. So I want to talk a little bit now about George Washington. And I want to talk a little bit about him from a little bit different perspective. The first painting of George Washington was done from life in 1772. It's owned by Washington and Lee University, and it was done by Charles Willson Peale. Charles Willson Peale painted Washington about 7 times, and this was the first one he did. And Washington sat for these paintings. He's portrayed here in the uniform of a colonel in the Virginia militia. You can see that he's a relatively young man. He's obviously a soldier. A close-up of his face, we see rosy cheeks and clear skin, and he overall looks pretty healthy. Yes?
Yes.
Mhm. So what we know about George Washington was that he was sick much of his life. He was, and quote, strongly attacked by smallpox. When he got smallpox, he was bedridden for 3 weeks, and he was left with pockmarks all over his face. But the good news was he was immune from smallpox for the rest of his life. He also suffered with severe bouts of dysentery, bloody diarrhea, and his rectum hurt so badly that he often could not ride on a horse. He had to have a pillow under him, or sometimes he would ride in a wagon, prone, because he just couldn't sit on a horse. So he says, he wrote to his mother, "I was not half recovered from a violent illness that had confined me to my bed and a wagon," couldn't ride a horse, "for above 10 days. I am still in a weak and feeble condition, which induced me to halt here 2 or 3 days in hopes of recovering a little strength." And that's when he was this guy. He had, in the course of his life, he had diphtheria, bloody diarrhea, pneumonia, influenza, and he had a large carbuncle on his face that may have been, physicians think it may have been skin cancer or it may have been a precancerous condition. He may also have had malaria when he was 17, and he had multiple bouts of quinsy, and quinsy is tonsillitis or possibly strep throat. So he's been diagnosed in the present by physicians looking at his writings and saying, well, this is what they called it then, but this is what we know it to be now. And remember, this is in a time before antibiotics. The smallpox, we know, created blistery boils on his face and left him with scarring all over his face for the rest of his life. I always like to show this document when I'm talking about George Washington, because George said, quote, "The sword of the enemy." He said that smallpox was greater than the sword of the enemy, meaning he wanted his men vaccinated. And when I heard all of the commentators during the COVID shutdown say, well, we've never had forced vaccination before, I thought, not so true. George Washington insisted that the colonial army be vaccinated. He was even convinced that perhaps the British were bringing smallpox to the United States as a method of biological warfare. And he wanted everyone, he wanted the entire army to be vaccinated. And it's in this document that he talks about this. So here we have the Gilbert Stuart, the famous Gilbert Stuart painting. It's called, this is the Athenaeum portrait. Washington was here 64 years old. Gilbert Stuart first painted George Washington in 1795 in a work now known only from its copies. That painting was so successful that according to artist Rembrandt Peale, Martha Washington wished a portrait for herself. She persuaded her husband to sit again for Gilbert Stuart on the express condition that when finished, it should be hers. She wanted one. And this one is called the Lansdowne Portrait of George Washington. It's also by Stuart, and it's 1796 when he was 64. And you can see in this portrait that he chose to wear a black suit, very common George Washington outfit, not a military uniform. He's trim, he has an athletic build. He looks the part of president, not of military leader. This is the Arkell's portrait. Speaking of Stuart's ability to capture Washington's likeness, author John Neal wrote in his book, Randolph, and this was written in 1823, if Washington should appear on earth just as he sat to Stuart, I am sure that he would be treated as an impostor when compared with Stuart's likeness of him, unless he produced his credentials. So he's telling us, he doesn't think these paintings look at all like George Washington. So why does George Washington look like this? And in looking very, very carefully at his face, you do see on the left-hand side just a hint of a little bit of a crease or a pockmark. Is that where the carbuncle was removed? It had to be removed twice, by the way, by a physician, and they weren't terribly skilled. That was the status of medical care in the time period, that they were able to remove it, but it wouldn't be considered a terribly skilled method today. Everybody knows about George Washington's teeth. People talk about George Washington's teeth all the time. These are George Washington's teeth. What's interesting about them is that they are not wooden. They never were wood. Some of his enslaved people had wooden teeth. George Washington's teeth, he had one real tooth. And his false teeth were made of slaves' teeth, some of his enslaved people, some of their teeth, plus hippopotamus teeth. And they were huge, because this is how he made them, and he had to hold them in his mouth. You work really hard, which is why that pursed look that you see, he's holding in those teeth. And you can see this close-up of George Washington's face in our painting here, And also, I think the suggestion of scars, if you look closely, but still rosy cheeks, pretty good clear skin, but pursed mouth holding those teeth in. Living in Washington, D.C., and working at Gatsby's Tavern, I got to see this painting up close. This is by artist William Williams from 1793. And this was commissioned by the Alexandria, Washington Masonic Lodge, number 22, where Washington was a master. And it is believed that this is the portrait that looked the most like Washington. And he liked this one. Washington did not, contrary to popular belief, did not wear wigs. He didn't like wigs. This was his own hair that was painted, or this was his own hair that was painted. You can also see on the left side a little hint of perhaps some scarring. And does this look like the same person? This guy and this guy? And this is the 7th portrait that Charles Wilson Peale did of Washington from life in 1795. And it again shows his hair, his own hair, and a little bit of scarring on that left cheek. But all of the pock marks, none of these paintings show his skin pockmarked. There was a reason. They wanted the father of our country. He had to look good. You know, he had to be on the dollar bill. You know, this is right. This is the photograph that's on the dollar bill. So what his skin really looked like, we only know from descriptions. This is a painting called "The Death of Washington," and this is fascinating to me. It's likely that the physicians killed him. He had Washington was, I was thinking of my mother last night because my mother always said, you know, if you have on wet clothes, take them off or you're gonna get pneumonia. Well, Washington went out riding on his farm on a December day. It was cold and wet, it was snowing hard. And he came in and he didn't want to be late for dinner, so he was soaking wet, but he didn't change his clothes. And that night he felt very, very sick. And for the next several days he was sick. They called in the first physician, and he bled him. He bled him 1 cup. Okay. They called in 2 other physicians. By the time they had finished, and I was reading this last night and I thought, that is incredible. They had bled him 83 ounces, which is 1/4 of the entire amount of blood you have in your whole body. So they removed 83 ounces of blood from him, and he was already in a weakened condition. That's why I said it's possible that the physicians killed him. But this was the standard medical treatment of the time. So they weren't doing anything that they thought was dangerous. They really believed that bleeding him would cause the blood vessels in his throat to shrink, and that would cause his throat to open up. That was their rationale, that it would cause his throat to open up and he'd be able to breathe more freely. On top of that, they gave him molasses and butter to soothe his throat, which only caused him to choke. And to thicken the phlegm in his throat. Molasses is so very thick. So what I thought was most interesting was that we know who was at his bedside when he died, because it was written down. And this differs significantly from this picture. So I guess the question is this picture a lie? Because we know his wife sat at the foot of the bed. There she is. There's Martha. His friends, Dr. Craik and Tobias Lear, were there. So we assume that 2 of these men are Craik and Lear. But his enslaved housemaids, Caroline, Molly, and Charlotte, and his enslaved valet, Christopher Shields, stood in the room throughout the day. Where are they? They're not there. But we do know from accounts that they were there with him when he died. So I guess I asked, lots of folks say photographs don't lie. And I wonder, is that really true? We get lots of detail in photographs, right? We can see things that we don't see in paintings. We don't have to trust the artist when we look at photographs. But I guess I wanted to show you a couple of photographs where photographs do lie. This is a very famous photograph. It's one of the most popular hoaxes of the 19th century. That is Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife. And she was very, very religious and believed in spiritualism. And this is a spiritualist photograph that was done by a man named William Mumler. He did several of these. And can you see the ghost-like image of Abraham Lincoln standing with his hands on her shoulders? What's interesting about this photograph is we still don't know how it was done. It's not just a simple double exposure. So several people have tried to kind of figure it out, and there's not really a way to, so far, nobody's really figured out how it was done. And then I thought it would be interesting, as my final slide, to look at the first ever, since we're coming up on the presidential season, the first ever presidential debate. And what happened here was that Nixon refused makeup. Does anybody remember that?
Yeah.
He refused to wear makeup, and he had 5 o'clock shadow, and he had been campaigning hard all week, and he looked terrible. And he didn't look as good as the young and virile Jack Kennedy, who had been resting all week. So it was all, does the photograph lie? You know, Kennedy didn't refuse the makeup and was younger than Nixon. So I guess I would ask if the photograph lies. So I would love to entertain your questions, your comments, and your thoughts.